Do you remember?
There's a reason we're not in the music industry.
No, absolutely. But we did remember. Welcome to Night School, where we are celebrating the 21st night of September with a very special program. And the date fell on here. We could not resist. I'm one of your hosts, Aria.
And I'm another one of your hosts, Darian.
And every month we invite scientists, artists, and creators to dig into a new theme. In case you haven't guessed by now, tonight's is Earth, Wind, and Fire. And we've gathered together a seismologist, a meteorologist, and a fire ecologist to take a look at the massive, powerful natural forces that shape our environments, all from a safe distance, of course, virtually. We're thrilled to introduce you to our guest tonight. But first, there's something on our screen, Darian?
Aria, that would be the QR code.
The QR code?
You know, the one that links to the survey that'll help us to learn more about some of our favorite people on Earth, the Night School audience, so that we can continue to develop and grow this program with them in mind.
Oh my gosh, of course.
That one.
The QR code. And dear Night School friends, regulars and newcomers, if you're comfortable sharing a little bit about yourself, please check out that QR code or the link that we're dropping in the chat or comments. All your responses are going to be kept completely confidential, and anything that you do share will help us continue making Night School the best we possibly can. We're excited to get to know about you. And Darian, we're also excited to get to know about our guests. Who do we have the pleasure of meeting tonight?
First up, we have the pleasure of meeting Dr. Debi Kilb from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, a multi-hyphenate, a seismologist, video game designer, and artist. And now all these titles are exciting on their own, but Dr. Kilb combines all three in her super interesting intersectional work. And I'm so excited to hear how she studies seismology, like how one earthquake can influence another, and then use that research to create educational and playable interactive art.
Amazing. And next up, we're hearing from Dr. Sean Ernst, who is a storm chaser, a pro storm chaser, which is absolutely incredible. Tornadoes are some of the most powerful winds on the planet, and Sean is often chasing them down and documenting his journeys. And he'll share about how tornadoes form, why he gets near them, and what human impacts and ethical challenges might emerge from seeking out these gigantic winds. And hopefully he'll also share a few tips on how to talk like a pro storm chaser. I know he's got a very serious and very great video on his channel about that.
I can't wait to learn the lingo. Okay. Lastly, let's see. We've got a seismologist, that's Earth, meteorologist for wind. So lastly, I guess we'll hear from Nicholas Cruz, who is a fire ecologist. Now, fire holds potential for both destruction and restoration. And Nicholas is working with tribes in Lake and Mendocino County to return indigenous cultural burning, or good fire, to wetlands and woodlands. He'll share about the myriad ways that climate change, history, and land use complicate the reintroduction of indigenous cultural burning, and how he and his collaborators study how critical ecosystems flourish after cultural burns in order to envision what restoration of good fire may look like.
Absolutely. And as always, tonight's program is live. So whether you're with us on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitch, say hi, let us know where in the world you're watching from, and let us know if you have questions for any of these three phenomenal guests, because we will have a Q&A after every single one of their segments. And with that, we'll go ahead and turn it over to Debbie.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction. My name is Dr. Debi Kilb. I'm from Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UCSD, and this is my office, which is a wonderful place to work. Here's a roadmap of what we're going to talk about today. So just my journey on how I became a seismologist, earthquakes in general, earthquake early warning and how you can get alerts, science and art, and then a little bit of research on dynamic earthquake triggering. So let's start off with my wake up as a toddler and say, I want to be a seismologist. No, it was a very windy road. So in high school, I was very good at math and science, not so good at spelling. And so I took the science route. I did my undergrad in math, computer science. Then I went to UCLA and did a master's in math. And I hated it because I didn't check out the program. The program was completely test taking. It was completely based on test taking. And I'd rather write manuscripts and have some interaction and not just be in my own little corner taking a test. So it wasn't a good fit for me. It's a good fit for some people, but not everybody. Then my husband that's what they paid a grad student. So boom, seismology grad student. I was not really 100% in. I just thought this will fill the time until I figure out what I want to do. But then my first day in my seismology class, I fell in love with seismology. It was the perfect thing I was looking for. Something where there's different things to think about, different people to interact with in the vast geoscience field, and I was hooked. So that's when my seismology career began. Then I did a postdoc at Princeton. I did another postdoc at Scripps, and that's where I am today as a project scientist. All right, let's move on to earthquakes in general. So if we look at the largest earthquakes in the world, they're labeled and numbered here. The biggest by far is Chile, magnitude 9.5, which boggles your imagination. Alaska is on this list 3 times, 1964, 1965, and 1957. Indonesia is also on the list 3 times. Most people will think of the Indonesia 2004 earthquake as the tsunami earthquake. It also had large earthquakes in 2005 and 2012. Now, if you step back and really look at this picture, what you notice is that within the contiguous United States, not counting Alaska, we're not on the list there at all, which seems weird, right? I mean, we have California, we have the San Andreas Fault. Why are we not on that list? Well, it turns out California will never, ever, ever be on the top 10. And the reason is that our faults here are relatively shallow. They go down to 10 kilometers, maybe 20 kilometers. Earthquake in California. The biggest magnitude earthquake has maybe an 8.2. If you exaggerate a lot, maybe 8.3, maybe push to 8.4, but people would probably not believe you. So good news, California is never going to make this top 10 list. The chance of an earthquake in the next 24 hours somewhere around the globe is 100%. So every day somewhere there's an earthquake occurring, providing data for nerds like me. All right, let's move on to earthquake early warning. So earthquake early warning, something called the Shake Alert, is operational in California, Oregon, and Washington. And if you want to get alerts sent to you on your cell phone, you can do so. If you have an iPhone, you're going to need to download the MyShake app and set up your location and such. And if you have an Android phone, it will automatically push that information to you as long as you sign up correctly under the Settings and Safety and Emergencies tab. So what will happen is that we'll be monitoring the location of your cell phone. For MyShake, you just put in the general locations, use your data plan, watching you move around the city. And if there's a 4.5 or larger earthquake, it'll push that information to you if it thinks there will be large shaking at your location. So I would suggest anybody in California, Oregon, and Washington to definitely sign up for these. If you're interested in earthquakes in some region, you can sign up for them as well and watch what happens in Maine, etc. So to understand earthquake early warning, let's just dive in and start to understand what a seismogram is. So this is an example of a seismogram here on the left from one earthquake. So one earthquake will create 3 different seismic phases: a P wave, an S wave, and a surface wave. It's the fastest. It always comes in first. Always, nobody beats it. And the S wave and the surface waves are always more damaging. You can kind of estimate how far the seismic station that recorded this data is from the earthquake by looking at the time separation between the S wave and the P wave. In this example, it's 3 seconds. We multiply that by 10, so we know they're kilometers away. So now we're all trained seismologists, IW. Let's look at a larger view. Over on this side, we're seeing seismograms recorded at different stations. So each station is colored in a different color. And at the top, you can see that the separation between S and P wave is about 2.5 seconds or 25 kilometers away. Bottom in the blue trace, this seismic station is located about 110 kilometers away. So the name of the game in earthquake early warning is you want to detect the earthquake as quickly as possible, hopefully on the P wave. And if you have a lot of stations near the earthquake, that means you'll have a better chance of getting that information to people that are further away. All right, so let's look at it in this context. In this cartoon here, the little hockey pucks, these black things, those are in a north-south component. It'll record 1 second of data, send earthquake alert center. 1 second data, send it. 1 second, send. 1 second, send. Just continually getting that data as quickly as possible in small packets to the earthquake center. So let's go through the timing of what might happen. So the data is continually being recorded and sent to the earthquake center. And let's say an earthquake occurs here. Here's our fault. It's going to radiate the P and S waves, shown P with the yellow and S with the red. Sensors, and hopefully the first sensor will notice that there's some activity going on. So the earthquake early warning system will detect the earthquake optimally on the P wave, and they'll assess the alert if we need to distribute an alert message or not. And then you'll have possible warning times from right. So we're talking seconds, not days.
Hey, Debbie, 1 second. I think you're cutting out a bit. Would you mind just turning your camera off so we can hear
sure.
your audio a little clearer?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, is that better? Thanks for letting me know that.
Yes,
right.
I think so.
Okay. And ping me if it's not working. So Let's see. So here we're going to just put this on a map and get an idea of how much time do we have to duck, cover, and hold on. That's what DCHO is. When you feel earthquake shaking, you should duck, cover, and hold on. Don't forget the hold on part. So here we have an example of if there's an earthquake on the southern part of the San Andreas by the Salton Sea. Just to get our US-Mexico border, San Diego, where I'm at, is right here, San Clemente, Santa Monica, and Palm Springs. And if you're really close to the earthquake within these pink zones, you're in what's called the no alert zone, and there's just simply not enough time to get you the alert information. But if you're outside of the no alert zone, then alert. So in this scenario, Palm Springs would have about 26 to 30 seconds to duck, cover, and hold on. Pasadena would have 75 to 79 seconds to duck, cover, and hold on. So the farther away you are from the earthquake, the longer time you'll have to respond. So this is just an example from Southern California. Let's look at Northern California. So let's see, Cal Academy is here in the Bay Area, Berkeley, Napa, Sacramento. And for this hypothetical earthquake, it's just hypothetical kind of scratching stuff on the back of an envelope. In Gilroy, San Jose would have at max maybe 8 seconds to duck, cover, hold on. Menlo Park, 17. And as we get out, about 30 seconds in Santa Rosa, just under a minute. So this gives you a feel of how long you're going to have between when you get that alert on the phone and when you need to duck, cover, and hold on. So for those of you that have not been practicing your yoga diligently, maybe this is one reason to continue that, so you can easily get under your desk. All right, let's just briefly about science and art. It's something that's been near and dear to me for quite a this center, people would bring us their data and we would help them visualize it. Do you need it temporally, spatially, both, frequency, whatever it is you might need. And we would help them with that. And in that way, I got exposed to all kinds of different geoscience fields. I was also the director of SAO Games, and this was really fun. We created video products and games out of geoscience topics. So it was backed in real science, but it was fun to play. So we had some virtual reality, we had Oculus Rift, we had Narwhal game, Fox, Quake Catcher, etc. And we take those games out to the community. And in this way, we're marrying the science and the art, because we couldn't do this without the artists, without the programmers. And so we got to have conversations that involve science and art. So if you're somebody that likes science and art, there's definitely room for you at the table, and you shouldn't think that you have to go emo and pick the best one. All right, and the last topic is going to be on dynamic earthquake triggering, and this is a research topic. This is one of my favorite slides. I think this cartoon, it just epitomizes what dynamic earthquake triggering is. So let's just read the cartoon to start. The danger with studying anything this closely is that you lose sight. So our scientists looking in this giant telescope here, synonymous with dynamic earthquake triggering. So we can think of earthquakes as being induced by stress changes, and they can break that down into two types of stresses. The first is dynamic stresses, and it's generated by the passage of the seismic waves. And the second is static stress, and it's generated by permanent fault displacement. It's an order of magnitude smaller than dynamic stress. I think it's easier when we look at a cartoon. So here's before the earthquake. This is going to be our fault. The palm trees are nicely aligned here. During the earthquake, it's going to be sending out those seismic waves that are just wild. It's the things that's going to knock down your bookshelf or topple your plant. It's during the throes of the earthquake. That's the dynamic triggering portion. And after those seismic pass, you have static triggering. This might be where a fence is offset or something like that. So again, dynamic stresses are much bigger than static stresses. And here's just a reminder of that. If, for example, there's a big earthquake in Japan, it can trigger small aftershocks in Southern California. Not big ones, but something that we didn't know a few decades ago. So this is what, the reason this research came up was from the Landers earthquake in 1992. This is an example of a magnitude 7.3 earthquake. As a seismologist, when you go to look for the aftershocks, you usually looked within 1 to 2 main shock fault lengths. So red circles here. That's, seismologists would go out and say, let's see what kind of aftershocks we have here, put out some more seismic stations and call it a day. But what Dave Hill found is that aftershocks occurred at much, much, much larger distance. Instead of 1 to 2, we thought about earthquake source physics. A map that was from Dave's paper. So time is on the x-axis, starting in January. And the time of the Landers earthquake is the first part of this salmon color here. So let's just take a look at Lassen. Lassen has kind of a constant rate. There's a little blip here, but you can see the rate definitely increased here. In Cedar City, constant rate, the rate definitely increased. White Mountains, California, the rate definitely increased. So you don't really have to do any statistics on it. It's very clear that we're seeing a rate change across the Western US following the Landers earthquake. So exciting to see this. Let's just put it on the map so we can get a feel. So these are aftershocks within this pink box region. But after Landers, Dave Hill found them out in Cascadia, Idaho, Yellowstone, Wyoming, Cedar City, Utah, much, much further than we've had thought before. And I'm just going to leave it at that. It's still a head scratcher. We've been working on this for decades. Not only triggered by large amplitudes, might have a thing to do with the way the azimuth of the seismic waves traverse, maybe the pore pressure, fluids within the region. So we're still scratching our head on this and trying to figure out why are we getting these dynamic earthquake triggerings sometimes, but not always. And I invite any questions that you might have.
Hi, Debbie. That was wonderful and mind-boggling to learn how interconnected it all really is.
It really is.
Yeah, that's so wild. And we have some great questions, so I'll get right into it. But if anybody else out there wants to ask Debbie some more earthquake questions or art and SciComm questions, drop them in the chat. Debbie, if you want to turn your camera on again, I think we might have Wi-Fi capacity. Yeah, there we go. Hey. So, okay, first question about the games. How did you go about making fun and educational games when earthquakes can be like really scary and serious? Like, how did you manage to strike that balance?
Yeah. That's a really good question. So we don't want to diminish that people are hurt and there's some horrible things that happen from earthquakes, but we also know that the more you know about them and the more you know how to prepare for them, the better you'll do. And not many people are going to go to the talking head science talk at 7 in the morning at the museum. They're more apt to go to the bring your team, let's play these video games. And the way that we made sure that they weren't boring is that the programmer and the artists would keep me in check. I'm like, oh God, that's a great idea. Let's do this. And they're like, yeah, no. We had kind of a triad of people working on it and bouncing off ideas as to what we should do and what we shouldn't do. And it was pretty clear that I was not on the ideas.
Oh my gosh. No, that's so fun. It's cool that it was such a collaborative effort and like really brought in all your different expertises. That's awesome. When you do go about studying earthquakes, you talked a little bit about like going to see the data and going to check out sites of like the dynamic trigger sites, but can you tell us more about what the process is like of and the methods of studying earthquakes like on the ground? Oh no, I think we lost you. We'll give it a minute. Debbie, are you able to hear me?
I can only hear you on and off. Maybe put the question in chat. Would that work?
Yeah. That's a good idea. Darian, if you want to stick that in chat, that would be great. But for anyone watching, just asking about earthquakes generally, like, are there benefits to being physically near or on fault lines when studying them?
If you're close to the earthquake in a very like hard rock area, you can actually hear the P wave. And so that's on my list of things to do, is to hear a P wave. Probably not a good idea as to where you should live your life, but that's one thing that can help.
You can hear earthquake waves?
And then, Yeah. And that's why the dogs, a lot of people say that my dog predicted the earth, actually hearing the P wave coming through the granite rocks. Yeah.
Wow.
And I would say we don't necessarily need to be close to the faults to study them. We just need a lot of seismic stations that are very robust and operational.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense.
They've also started putting video on there. So if there's an earthquake, you can see the video as well, which is pretty exciting.
Oh, wow. Yeah, sounds like a lot of really cool advancements as you all like grow closer to understanding these like
That's right.
gigantic forces. Yeah, that's really cool. Well, thanks so much for your time, Debbie. It was lovely hearing from you.
Thank you for including the program. I'm looking forward to the others.
Yeah, a pleasure. And we're going to go ahead and welcome up Dr. Sean Ernst.
All right. Hey there, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, I'll go ahead and get started. So my name is, as I was introduced, Dr. Sean Ernst. I am a meteorology PhD out in Norman, Oklahoma, where for my day job, I study the communication of weather and things like tornado warnings, as well as a product called the Storm Prediction Center's Convective Outlook. But when the weather takes a turn for the south and things get a little stormy, I like to jump in my car, grab my nice video camera, and see what kind of spinning water vapor I can see. So for this section of tonight's festivities, we'll be talking about wind and chasing some of nature's most intense swirls. So, tornadoes, what are they? They are defined as a violently rotating column of air, and they're most common in these special kinds of thunderstorms called supercell thunderstorms, which you can see a diagram of on your screen right now. There can also be tornadoes in these storms called squall lines, but most strong tornadoes occur in these supercells. They're called that because while most thunderstorms are a convective cell where you have air rising and then falling somewhere else, usually in the downdraft of the storm where all the rain falls, supercell thunderstorms have a rotating updraft called a mesocyclone. Underneath that mesocyclone, the conditions are just right for tornadoes to form if a couple other things come together, which we'll get into in this talk. So note, however, that I said a supercell or a tornado is a violently rotating column of air. In this photo, you know, it's a little ominous looking, it's a little scary, but it's maybe not something that you're gonna, be too freaked out about until I press play and you see that dust cloud there at the bottom of this on the ground is actually rotating, with the cloud above it rotating quite rapidly. This was a weak tornado that was occurring in the field about 2 miles away. It's just a tornado is a violently rotating column of air, not necessarily condensed cloud. So not all tornadoes are something that you're going to be able to see with your eyes, but you can look for that evidence, like that rotation and that dust getting kicked up, that can suggest that maybe there's something a little scary going on there. So, of course, the question becomes, how do you find tornadoes? We've got these storms, these supercells. Tornadoes occur on time scales of minutes to maybe a little bit over an hour in length. They're not very large either. It's kind of like playing whack-a-mole. You got to find this thing in this giant, or you're finding a needle in a haystack the size of the Great Plains. So there's a few things we can use to look for these storms. The first thing we can do is we need to look for something called shear. Shear is when you have changing winds with height in the atmosphere. We can look for shear by looking at the wind moving at different levels. So right here, we're looking at the winds at 500 millibars on a day, and we see that there's something called a jet streak, where there's very fast moving air aloft above us in the atmosphere moving across the Great Plains. So I've labeled it with that arrow there. Now, if we look back at the wind at the surface, we see that there's a fetch of moisture and warm air blowing northward up from the Gulf of Mexico into the Great Plains. That means that we're moving from southerly winds to these much faster winds coming out of the south and west when we get into the upper atmosphere. That means that in this blue shaded area, we've got enough shear to produce these supercell thunderstorms. Now, the next thing you need is lift. You need some force that's going to cause air to rise and make thunderstorms form. On this particular day, we've got two major sources. We've got what's called an outflow boundary, which is cold air that's been blown out by thunderstorms earlier in the day, and a dry line, which is a boundary between moist air and dry air off to the west coming out of the deserts of New Mexico, which means we've got some ingredients there for lift in those areas around those boundaries. Next, we need instability for storms. As you've heard in school, hot air rises. And the hotter and more moist the air, the more convective available potential energy, or CAPE, is available to storms. There's also something called convective inhibition, or SIN, which means that you might have warmer air aloft in the atmosphere, that when that little bubble of warm rising air hits it, it's going to become cooler than the surrounding air and sink back down. It's going to be inhibited from rising. So we've got a lot of CAPE in this area here that I'm going to highlight. When we get rid of that CAPE map there, we see that there's starting to be some overlap between these ingredients for supercell thunderstorms. The final thing we want to look for is moisture. And generally, if you've got dew points over 60 degrees Fahrenheit, that's a pretty good indicator for the potential for supercell thunderstorms. You can get supercells in lower moisture. You can get them in much higher. But 60 degrees is usually a good, first guess kind of look. And if we look at this map, the area where we see those 60-degree dew points is reaching well up into Iowa, but is also overlapping with all those other ingredients we've looked at. So when you combine that, we look at SLIM, which is shear, lift, instability, moisture, and we find that overlap exists for tornadoes in northern Oklahoma and the Texas Panhandle. And in fact, on this day, there was a record, or not a record, but there was one supercell that produced 13 tornadoes in the space of 2 hours near Dodge City, Kansas, right along that outflow boundary. Now, we've got a storm, and this storm happens to have a tornado, but what exactly are we looking at here? I've provided a diagram in the upper left of this image here, and you can see that red dot is where we are, and that cone is sort of our field of vision looking at this storm. So we're looking at this storm from east of the tornado, looking back towards the west. Now, there's a couple features that you can actually see in a photo like this that tell us kind of what's going on in this storm here. For starters, you see there's that inflow that comes out of the south side of this cyclonically or counterclockwise spinning supercell. That's the inflow to the storm. That's that warm, moist air that's going to rise up into the atmosphere and power that rotating updraft as well as the tornado. However, we can also see this large misty area on the right side of the image, and that's something called the forward flank downdraft. This is that chaser lingo that the hosts were mentioning earlier during the introduction session. A forward flank downdraft is the part of the storm that's ahead of that rotating updraft, that mesocyclone. This is an area that we often call the core of the storm. And if you want to make life choices, which I may or may not have made in the past a few times and broken a few windshields doing, you can do something called punching the core, which is when you drive straight through that red area in the diagram, which is where most of the large hail is usually going to be located, hence the broken windshield. In this case, however, there's also something called a rear flank downdraft, which is unique to supercells. It's an area of rain that's been wrapped back around towards the end side of the storm by that rotating updraft. And this rear flank downdraft wraps around the area where the tornado is going to form and is very important to the tornado life cycle, as oftentimes a big surge in this rear flank downdraft will cut off the inflow into that tornado and result in the tornado dissipating. Even though the storm may continue, it may not be able to produce tornadoes once that cold air has settled underneath it. So, a lot of really interesting things we can see in this photo, but if you notice, right where that T is in the diagram between the rear flank downdraft and the forward flank downdraft is right where we see our tornado. So this supercell that we have this image of here that I was lucky enough to experience back in 2021 in Northwest Texas is a great example of kind of the things that you want to look for when you're out looking at storms. Here's another example with animation of a supercell thunderstorm, and now you can really see that rotating updraft. You can see that inflow in all that dust getting kicked up, getting sucked right into the base of that rotation. And you can even see right at the bottom there near that telephone pole, there's some really rapid rotation. That's exactly where we would see that tornado form, because that little horseshoe shape to the left of it is where that downdraft is cutting down through the updraft and wrapping around the tornado location, right where you get this combination of the air moving down out of the storm, the wind moving into the storm, right under that updraft. That's where you want to watch out for that tornado to occur. So, now that we know where to look for tornadoes and what we're looking at when we see a supercell thunderstorm, let's go on a storm chase. Sounds easy, right? All I know is that the first step is you want to, kneel down on the ground, pick up a nice handful of dirt and drop it out there, look at the clouds, say, we got some greenage. And then you go, get your buddies together in your cars and get your anemometers and all your fancy weather equipment on there. Drive down the road, wherever Bill Paxton tells you to go. And all of a sudden there's a tornado just drops out of the sky. There it is. You're driving right next to it in a gully and maybe a little too close. You might want to get under a bridge before your car gets lifted away by the tornado. That was pretty cool. Now we'll go back to the red truck that we were driving with our girlfriend at the time. And well, now we got cows and two tornadoes that split from one another and all sorts of crazy, cool stuff going on. And we had a great storm chase. Look at all these cool pictures. And we did a great job. That's definitely what happens every single time I go storm chasing. That's not what happens every time I go storm chasing at all. It's very much not like the movie Twister, even though Twister is definitely one of my favorite movies. In reality, if we're going on a real storm chase, it looks a little more like this. I start the morning off looking at computer model forecasts and trying to suss out where the storms are most likely to occur. We bring up a map like this and plan out a 4.5-hour drive to Southwest Kansas. Oh boy. And then we get there and we just see a weak updraft that is very skinny and not really able to get its act together. I wish, I'd just stop this day and go home. And you can see I'm right there on that storm where a couple of hail reports were. Well, all the tornado action was further up in northern Kansas because I got my forecast wrong. And now I'm bored and sad that I missed out the action. That is how most storm chases go. You're either in the wrong place, nothing happens, or it's just not a storm that's going to produce a tornado. It's very rare to see a tornado on a storm chase, and I can say probably less than 25% of the times I go out actually see any tornadoes that I can photograph. So I generally end up looking a bit more like this guy. But once in a while, you get a special kind of day. One example of this happened earlier this year on April 19th. Where the Storm Prediction Center issued a mesoscale discussion for my area. Remember, I live in Norman, saying that there was a conditional severe risk increasing with a potential for supercells with large hail and tornadoes later in the evening. So I get in my car with my friends. That's one key thing to remember is you want to be with your friends. Doing this solo is very dangerous. And we got together and drove out towards Dibble, Oklahoma, where we saw some updrafts on radar that were worth chasing. So we headed out that way to that star right there and positioned ourselves just to that south and east area away from the supercell so we could get a view of where those tornadoes might form. Those storms developed and moved towards the northeast as the day went on. And we saw this wall cloud form, which is a potential precursor to a tornado. However, this storm was not located in a very good place. We were in Newcastle, Oklahoma, just southwest of Norman, and this storm was headed off to the northeast, right into the metro area where there's heavy traffic on I-35, tons of people freaking out because they're in a tornado warning, just absolute chaos. You do not want to be in an urban area when there's a tornado threat. So we did not follow this storm any further. Luckily for us, there was another big storm forming to the southwest of this one. So we went back down 35, out back to Dibble, and found our way to this storm. So as you can see, there's this massive base, much larger than that one that I wasn't so happy with a couple slides ago. And you can see all the rotation going on underneath that storm. There's a huge rain-filled rear flank downdraft in there. That's all that fuzziness in the center of the screen down the road. Now we're getting a little bit further away from the storm. You can just see all this corkscrew shape to the updraft. It's this massive rotating cloud. And there's a lot of rotation going on under this the center of the storm. And you can actually see there was a brief tornado in the center of your screen there. It's just we never got a really good view of it because it was completely wrapped in rain, which happens a lot with these more high precipitation supercells like this one. So now we're driving down the road. The tornado is lifted, but this storm is cycling and rearranging itself to produce a new tornado. Now we're back in Dibble. You can see there's a lot of other storm chasers out there. Honestly, that's one of the most dangerous parts of the chase is the other drivers, not just the storm. But you can see there's a large dark mass on the right side of that rain shaft there. And that is where something really nasty was about to show up. We've got that rear flank downdraft wrapped around, all that inflow streaming into the storm. And as those rain curtains start to disperse a little bit, you can see an ominous dark cloud in there. And that's when I got my camera out and saw this.
Oh man, it's just sitting there. Are we doing okay? How are we doing about?
So this is a wedge tornado, named a wedge because of that wide, sort of almost like a wedge of cheese shape. It is a EF3 tornado in the town of Cole, Oklahoma, which unfortunately ended up taking 2 lives. You can really see it showing up now with those well-defined left and right edges emerging from the rain.
Oh my God.
That wind noise you hear actually isn't the tornado. It's just the wind howling into the storm. Tornadoes often are said to sound a bit like a rainfall or a waterfall or a train approaching. That's the sound of debris smacking around in that powerful, powerful wind.
That's a huge wedge, dude. This camera. It's good. It's still in the shot. It's still in the shot.
Yeah, but the view is way better over here.
So spoiler there, the view was not better over there because the tornado went and got wrapped in the rain again. But that was the EF3 Cole tornado, again, on April 19th of this year. And I just briefly, I know I'm a bit over time, but I want to talk a little bit about the aftermath of this storm because it's super cool to go out and see these tornadoes. But it's really important to also remember that they are devastating events. This tornado caused EF3 damage and, as I mentioned before, took 2 lives in the town of Cole, Oklahoma, and continued to do EF1 and EF2 damage well up into the Goldsby area, as you can see in these photos here. I also want to note that that orange star that you see in the upper right is where my house is. This was one of the most unnerving storm chases I've ever been on because I was terrified that this storm was going to curve and track right into my neighborhood. And not just that, we also had a tornado move through South Norman along Highway 77/9 there in February of that year. So it was a really raw year this year for tornadoes in Norman, Oklahoma. And it was really unnerving for me on this storm chase. I was really anxious. But in any case, to wrap up my talk here today, I know I've gone pretty quickly and a bit over time, but storm chasing is this amazing experience where I get to take these beautiful photos of these incredible natural events as well as videos and really just sort of experience one of the last unknowns of the world. You know, you don't know what's going to happen when you go out on that chase, but you know, it's generally going to be something you don't expect. And sometimes you don't see a tornado, but you see a beautiful scene that you get to enjoy on this beautiful part of the country, the Great Plains. But it's important to remember that these storms take so much from people, not just lives, but property, homes, your feeling of safety. And so it's really important to me that during my day job, I do a lot of work to try and reduce the impact that these storms have by helping people get better information in their forecasts and make better decisions with them. But with that, that's my talk for today. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Sean, for that presentation. I am in awe. I'm a little terrified, if I'm being honest. Like, what compelled you to chase your first storm? If I saw something like that in real life, I would very much go in the opposite direction. What draws you towards them?
So I can tell you that my kindergarten teachers still call me the weatherman, and any of my friends who might be watching who knew me as a kid always knew that I really wanted to see tornadoes. I don't know what it was, a trip up Mount Washington in New Hampshire, maybe staying around the nonfiction section in my library and seeing a tornado book, but whatever it was, I've been hooked for a long, long time. And once I got out here to Oklahoma for school in 2015, I've been chasing ever since, and I'm on my 9th year in a row seeing a tornado. So pretty crazy stuff there.
It's a pretty wild streak. As someone who has lived most of my life in places where tornadoes aren't very common, I hear that like the telltale sign that a tornado is approaching is a green sky. What is up with that? Is that true? What causes it, if so?
So this is probably a good example of just a correlation that can occur. That green sky is not something that we've super nailed down in meteorology, but it seems to be related to the presence of very large water droplets or hailstones in a cloud. The reason is that the light is getting diffracted and bent and reshaped by all of these objects that it has to pass through. And so you get more of a green or a steely blue light out of those clouds that are laden with these giant water droplets and hailstones. Supercell thunderstorms, which produce tornadoes, frequently have large hailstones in their downdrafts. And so oftentimes you'll see that bluish color to the downdrafts around a tornado. But you don't necessarily get a tornado whenever you've got hail in a cloud. So it's not necessarily an indicator that a tornado is coming, but it's certainly an indicator that a strong storm is coming that you're probably going to want to pay attention to and maybe take shelter from. Best way to know if a tornado is coming is a tornado warning from the National Weather Service.
Yes, absolutely. I too am very much looking forward to using forward and rear flank downdraft in my everyday speech now. I can
also recommend core
as many
punching when
sentences
you're
as possible.
going through a big bit of rain, and hook slicing is the other one when you go through that hook on the back of the thunderstorm.
Core punching is when you like have enough money to replace a windshield. That's like what you do for fun.
You fix some paint chips on your car. I have got a few of those from June this year that I got to still fix.
I mean, from your presentation, I learned why some tornadoes are visible and some aren't. I heard that some are cloaked in rain. Wedge tornadoes is a new term that I've learned. I didn't realize there was such variety in kind of what tornadoes can look like. Are there any types that are especially rare or any ones that you would be really excited to see?
So honestly, in that last slide in my presentation, my favorite tornadoes are those really tall, skinny ones that are often called elephant trunk tornadoes, just because they can dance and weave in these just mesmerizing patterns. And they often have what we call a drill bit circulation at the bottom, because it can really rip into the ground and the earth and just pull things up, grass, dirt, unfortunately, oftentimes homes and things like that. But I think those elephant trunk tornadoes are my favorite, and they're usually a little bit more on the rare side, because usually the lower your cloud base is to the ground, the easier it is to form a tornado, just because you're closer to where that air is really rocketing up into the sky. But I think those are probably the rarer type, at least visually, but also my favorite type to see.
Exciting. Someone in our audience asks, are there ways to build structures or buildings that are tornado resistant, like buildings in like San Francisco, for example, are built to be like earthquake resistant? Is that something that you can kind of architecturally plan for?
Absolutely. And that's something I really like to advocate for as well, because, you could build a concrete bunker or like a geodesic dome house that is built to withstand winds of up to 300 miles an hour. Or you could just build an underground home and then you don't have to worry about tornadoes whatsoever. But that's really expensive. And personally, I like a little bit of natural light in my house. So that's not so much for me. But there are things that can be done to your average everyday home to make it much safer in a tornado. And much more importantly, the house may not survive the tornado, but you are much more likely to survive in one of these strengthened homes. The answer is that you need your foundation or you need the structure of the home to be bolted to the foundation using wind load bolts that you can. I'm not an expert structural guy, but I know these are a very important thing to have. But the other thing that you can add to your home is hurricane clips, which are often added to homes, and I believe sometimes part of building codes in Florida, which are these metal clips that are fastened at the joints of your home, because most homes are built to only withstand force coming from one direction, which is the force of gravity pulling them down. These homes with these wind adjustments are built to also resist upward and side-to-side wind forces, so that they are more likely to stay standing and together. Your roof is more likely to stay on, and that means they're more likely to protect you from all that debris and stuff that's flying around in that tornado at hundreds of miles an hour that you really got to stay away from. So that also, I can briefly say, if you've ever wondered what to do in a tornado, the best thing to do is to shelter in the center of your home. Something like a bathroom, a closet underneath a stairwell, really great options, because you want to think of it this way: you're putting as many walls between yourself and all that stuff spinning around outside.
Absolutely. That's very important info to have. This has been so informative for me. This feels kind of like exposure therapy. The more I know, the less I fear, in a small way. I don't think I'm ready to core punch yet, but we'll make our way there. Thank you so much, Sean, for sharing with us. Up next, we are going to hear from Nicholas Cruz.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me at NightSchool, and to the host especially. My name is Nicholas Cruz, and I'm a PhD student at UC Santa Cruz in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology department. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about my work studying indigenous cultural burning of tribes in Northern California, and you know, the process of doing that kind of research. Let's see. Okay, so I recently moved to Spring Valley, which is about 15 minutes east of Clear Lake. You can see on the map Clear Lake in the center, and I'm right around that area where the Pawnee Fire happened. The picture on the top is a photo from the 2018 ranch fire, which spotted, meaning that it, you know, through embers, went beyond the perimeter of the fire, landed in Spring Valley where I currently live, and destroyed 2 homes. And so Lake County is pretty familiar with fire. When I told someone that I was moving to Spring Valley, they were like, hasn't that place been evacuated every year due to fires? So it's a big thing here, and a lot of people have lost homes, and wildfire has been a pretty big shaping force in the area. Before this, I was living in Oakland and applying to graduate school in 2020. When I remember waking up, and I'm sure many of you share this experience, waking up one day and it was dark as if it was night, but it was just from the smoke from fires miles away. And I'd always been interested in fire ever since I was young, but those mega fires really got everyone's attention about the scale of the problem created by several hundred years of fire suppression under colonialism, although that's not how everyone framed it at the time. But there was this kind of growing understanding that about the history of indigenous burning that had maintained the health of California's forests before colonization, before tribes were displaced from their land and put into reservations and missions. They used fire as a major tool for managing landscapes. So around this time that a lot of news was coming out about indigenous burning and the wildfires, was when I decided this is what I wanted to study. I want to do whatever ecological research would support these efforts. And my background in sociology as an undergraduate student helped me understand the historical context of this effort to reintroduce fire and colonization, but I really wanted, you know, practical hands-on ecological restoration skills. So let's take a step back and talk about the scale of fire, or the lack of fire in California, rather. So in 2020, we saw a record-breaking 4 million acres burned in wildfires. The past 2 years, we've actually had a lot less. We had a really wet winter, so we kind of, this summer has been less fire activity than we were expecting. Yet, even with that really high 2021 number, that's still less than, sorry, it's not that the animation is not working. So around 4.8 million is the estimated average acres that were burned pre-colonization through a combination of indigenous burning and some more rare lightning fires that occur naturally. So even as climate change and fuel buildup make fires bigger and hotter and burn seasons longer, we still need more intentional fire or good fire rather than less fire. There were less than 500,000 prescribed burns or acres burned in California in 2020. And the goal for the state and federal agencies is about 1 million acres per year. And we haven't met that yet since they created that goal. And at the same time, tribal communities across the state, but also the country and the world actually are working to reintroduce fire to their traditional territories where their ancestors had used fire to manage culturally important plants, facilitate hunting and harvesting for generations. So as I was starting my PhD and talking to people about how to get involved in this kind of research, someone told me the best way to start burning is go get your wildland firefighting certificate or a red card. So I started looking for TREXs. I found this website announcing a TREX, which is Prescribed Fire Training Exchange. It was happening about 3 hours north of Santa Cruz, where I was living and going to school. And it was specifically focused on cultural burning. So it was an open invitation to anyone who wanted to come and learn about cultural burning, and I jumped up the opportunity. Ecologists don't often wait for an invitation to do research on indigenous lands. So I was like, yeah, I'm there. I woke up at 4 a.m. and drove 3.5 hours to Robinson Rancheria to get there for 9 a.m. start of the conference. And there I met Terra, which is the Tribal Eco Restoration Alliance, this group photographed here, along with partners in the Forest Service, CAL FIRE, BLM, and several nonprofits. And they were hosting this conference as a kickoff of a year-long series of trainings and eventually burns as part of the TREX. So we did online and in-person trainings about fire safety, the various positions in a fire crew and how to operate water pumps. We also learned how to make rope using the plants that we were burning. We learned the importance of certain plants and their preferences and adaptations for fire. It was kind of unique in fire trainings in that it incorporated indigenous knowledge and was led by indigenous practitioners while also, meeting the requirements of the National Wildlife Coordinating Group certification. So we also started to conduct burns. The training led to the formation of an on-call prescribed burn crew, which would respond to any prescribed burn held in Lake County. I had to take the PAC test, which is a physically exhausting physical test, and to become a certified wildland firefighter, alongside dozens of other community members new to fire in Lake County. And it was only after a couple of these trainings and meeting people several times and coming to burns that I really started to seriously talk to them about doing research, doing my dissertation research in collaboration with Terra and the tribes they work with. So in the process of talking with them about what sort of work they were doing and what kind of research would be useful to them, these two habitats came up a lot. So tule wetlands around the lake and oak woodlands and savannas. Both are ecosystems that are extremely important both ecologically and culturally, and they have also been severely reduced and threatened over the course of colonization. Nearly 85% of tule wetlands had been removed from Clear Lake, mostly by landowners who wanted a better view of the lake. And throughout the mid-1900s, oaks were systematically removed on the recommendation from the USDA because they were supposedly interfering with cattle range production. And so California lost about 1 million acres of blue oak woodland to herbicide, bulldozing, chopping down trees because they thought they were not good for raising cattle on. We now know that's false. Oaks actually improve woodland for livestock as well as habitat for wildlife, in addition to providing acorns, basketry material, and medicines. So we have these two ecosystems that were culturally very important and traditionally were managed with fire. But in this area, indigenous people hadn't conducted cultural burns in at least a generation. And so these ecosystems, like many of ecosystems in the Americas, are severely impacted by the effects of colonization. And now we're in the process of collaborating to reintroduce fire and studying the ecological and cultural effects of reintroducing fire. So in spring 2021, Terra conducted their first cultural burn along the lakeshore. It historically was burned throughout California. Many wetlands, including in the Bay Area and the Sacramento Delta, were burned pretty regularly to clear thatch. In Clear Lake, it's not clear how often or when tule was burned, but many Pomo elders recount their grandparents and parents talking about burning the tules to reduce the thatch that builds up after several seasons of growth, which chokes out new growth of green stems that are harvested for cultural use. So this is the regrowth soon after Terra's first burn in 2021. When I visited the tule for the first time to see the results of that burn during the conference, I noticed there was sort of a natural experiment going on. So to the left off screen of this picture was a wildfire scar that I could see where a wildfire had burned all the way to the lake. It killed mature willow trees and tule, leaving only invasive herbaceous plants. Next to that was a spring burn they had conducted before I had come out here, separated by an unburned area, which we eventually burned on the right, the fall burn area, separated by a mode control line. So these were 3 different treatments allowing us to compare, how tule regrew depending on when or if it was burned versus if it was cut or left untreated. Because the knowledge around cultural burning amongst Robinson tribal members was somewhat lost due to relocation, Terra identified the timing of burns as something that they want to know, to relearn. And so we decided to set up some experimental burns where we burned the tule at different times in the dormant season and compared their regrowth. So our first fall 2022 burn was very hot and fast. It went through a 2-acre burn unit in a matter of minutes. And it left only centimeters of thatch. So you can see it's very bare. You can only see the game trails where animals had walked through and compressed the tule. And in December, the conditions were much colder and wetter. So the thatch burned, not completely, especially when it was laying down densely and compacted. It didn't burn at all. And you can actually see here in front of me, there's some areas where you can see a little ash. The fire had already moved through this area, but it maintained a lot of the thatch. So I brought out a couple of teams of undergraduate students with me to collect pre-burn data on the density of living stems, the height of thatch and living stems, the species composition, invasive species cover, and one species in particular that the tribe is trying to monitor and control. As you can see on the picture on the left, the unburned tule thatch is very dense, and the tule themselves are so tall and dense that you can't even see Ryan, who has crawled through to go in there and set up a quadrat. And in those moments, when we're out there in the tule, I often tell my students about the story of how tule actually saved many Pomo people. So during what is known as the Bloody Island Massacre in 1850, which occurred not too far from where this research takes place, a white settler militia and cavalry led by Lieutenant Nathaniel Lyon, who the street in San Francisco is named after, committed a massacre against Pomo people, including women, children, and elders. And only a few women and children survived by actually hiding in the dense tule until the soldiers left. So as we're crawling through the tule, counting it, measuring its stems, collecting samples for biomass, I always try to remind myself and my students and be cognizant and respectful of this history and also of this plant and how important it is to the people who we're working with. And the results of that first year of the study are in the process of being analyzed. And they're also subject to an Indigenous data sovereignty agreement, which I'll talk a little bit more at the end of the talk. So I can't share preliminary results until I consult with them. But I will say that we are learning that burn timing can be shifted based on the different cultural and ecological objectives. So for example, if you want a lot of stems for basketry, a lot of smaller stems for basketry, versus fewer but bigger stems for boat building. We're also kind of think about patchiness, both in timing and area burned, and the return intervals that you burn in are essential to having good wildlife habitat, water quality benefits, as well as cultural use. And the Oak project is just starting up this year, and we're preparing to collect pre-burn data before we conduct replicated experimental burns in the fall and winter. But we're interested in investigating what ecologists call the oak regeneration problem. There's a lot of debate about what's causing oaks not to recruit into new adults. It could be drought, it could be herbivory by deer and cattle, invasive species competition as seen here, or the lack of fire, and is probably a combination of all of these. But one study by researchers at UC Berkeley found that pre-colonization, there was a pretty steady trickle, not a whole lot, but every few years there would be new trees recruiting into the overstory. And right around 1850, the time of the gold rush and the influx of many American settlers, there's a huge spike in recruitment. And these were the sprouts that grew back from the stumps of clear cutting that was done to supply the gold rush for fuel and for cattle ranching. Since then, with the enforcement of fire suppression, there's been practically no recruitment happening. And many parts of California, it's pretty hard to find recruiting oaks. As the director of Terra says, if you walked into a town and you saw only toddlers and very, very old elders, you'd probably wonder what terrible thing had happened there. Today, we see oak stands where there are ancient trees that are all around the same age, surrounded by tiny seedlings that rarely make it past the browse line. Sometimes you'll see a bush that is like 30 years old and is barely knee height because it's been browsed down so many times. So we're really interested in investigating the role that cultural burning has on oak regeneration. We'll be testing different burn treatments and techniques to protect young seedlings and saplings and tracking their survival and resprouting post-fire. And we're also really interested in how fire affects acorn harvest, specifically by reducing the population of acorn weevils, which are pictured here on the left. These are their larvae. The adults lay their eggs in the acorns while they're still in the trees. They drop and their larvae crawl out. And they render the acorns both inedible for cultural use and potentially unviable. So they might actually interrupt germination of oaks. So I want to leave you with a few closing thoughts to wrap up this talk. First, as an ecologist, I always have to consider the ways that history and social structures like settler colonialism have shaped and altered the ecosystems that I study. Oak trees aren't struggling in a vacuum. They're affected by drought, exacerbated by climate change. They feed people and wildlife. Their seedlings are being devoured by introduced cattle or by deer whose predators were removed to protect those cattle. And indigenous fire has been removed from their ecosystem and is only now being reintroduced. Second, this research is really in service of indigenous sovereignty. And so I try to do it in a way that builds indigenous sovereignty, including sovereignty over data, biological samples, and cultural knowledge. So indigenous data sovereignty is a control of data produced on tribal land using tribal knowledge by those tribes. Often what happens is researchers from universities reach out to tribes with a research proposal and say, we want to work with you, and then just extract knowledge or data or samples and publish it with no say or input from the community. So I'm in the process of developing a data use agreement with Robinson Rancheria to ensure that whatever comes out of this research is to the benefit of the tribe and that they get to decide how it's used. As this Carroll et al. Paper laid out, data governance is linked to and should be in service of governance and nation rebuilding. Doing ecological research like this is much less common than, say, in anthropology or sociology, although those fields have their own issues historically with working with tribes. And it is hard. I have to do my research within the confines of a data use agreement. I have to ask for approval at every step. I have to be very flexible. I can't just go and say, okay, we're going to do this and measure this, like other colleges get to do in so-called study systems or natural reserves. But despite the challenges, this kind of ecological research is very fulfilling. Standing around the fire, watching it carry through the tule and your time person next to you who is also carrying 45 pounds of water on their back and gear is when you really feel the gravity of what we're doing. Reintroducing good fire in a place that has experienced profound violence to both the people and to the land and its people. And yet we always have fun and we're always in high spirits at burns. And it feels like a very important thing that we're doing as we're laying down fire at a place that hasn't seen it in a good way in a very long time. It's only seen destructive large wildfires. And so my hope is that as a researcher, I can aid that process in some way. So as we say after each fire, it was good burning with you, and thank you. And I would love any questions that you have.
Hi, Nicholas. Thank you so much for sharing with us. Hearing you talk about the experience of being out there is like really magical. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing. We have a bunch of questions. First, I remember you said earlier that you like to ask this question to people, and you mentioned being interested in fire from a young age. So what is your earliest memory of fire?
Yeah, I ended up cutting it for time, and if people want to drop in the comments what their earliest memory for fire is, I would love to read them. So mine is actually lighting a candle on an altar in the house of our childhood home, and it was just me and my mom home at the time, and I go back to play video games on my computer, and I walk by and I realize that the entire wall has caught on fire. Like the candle lit a little piece of I think, yeah, it was like some piece of wood that was on there, and it lit the corner of the wall on fire. So I run and get the fire extinguisher and I put it out, and my mom praised me as a hero, and I just felt really guilty because I was like, I started that fire, like that was my fault. So that was actually my first experience. It was very scary and very like shameful to have started that fire. And then as I got older and started making little fires in the backyard and like camping, I started to kind of develop that curiosity about fire that led me to this.
Yeah, totally. And it sounds like along the way you also developed a curiosity for history and sociology, but also ecosystems. I would love to know more about the other organisms and things you've seen living in Tule wetlands and in oak ecosystems.
Yeah, so oak is known as like the most biodiverse ecosystem in California, I believe. Like so many wildlife rely on oak ecosystems, many birds, golden eagles, all kinds of really important and like endangered species live in oak woodlands. And same with Tule wetlands, actually, in Clear Lake, there are many native fish that are really struggling, partially because they've lost Tule habitat, which forms this really cool matrix with its roots where they can go and escape from predators. And so without that, they're lacking protection. I also recently, we went back and did a post-burn survey, and I saw these tree frogs that I'd never seen before. And they look like something that you would picture in like the Amazon rainforest. But they were jumping from Tule to Tule. And so as we walked, you like see like through the Tule, all these little frogs jumping around. And that was just incredible.
Oh, that is so sweet. What does it sound like when you're out in these ecosystems? Like hearing that there are frogs there.
Yeah. There's also I think it's called the Pacific chorus frog. So you hear those often. It sounds like they're singing. And then you also hear a lot of birds. Actually, there are a lot of small birds that build nests in the Tule. And so you, like as you're counting stems, you'll hear those birds' songs, or also they'll come kind of check you out and be like, "What are you doing in my home?" Yeah.
Like, hey. Yeah.
I very much associate, if you have heard like a red-shouldered blackbird, it's kind of like a robotic call, like that. That's what I associate with being out in the Tule.
Okay, cool. I will be going to look at iNaturalist for red-shouldered blackbird, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And calls.
And it looks exactly like what you'd imagine.
Yeah, red-shouldered blackbird. Amazing. So when you're out there counting Tule, can you tell us a little bit more about the methods that you've been using to, like you mentioned that kind of like natural experiment that set up, but yeah, tell us more about the methods that you use while you're out there.
Yeah, so it's funny, the Tule is actually pretty difficult. When I first went out there, I had this idea that I was going to set up transects, so like lines where I would measure along every few meters. And I went out there, and the Tule was taller than I was, and I could stand on top of the thatch, and I couldn't even see the ground, and I couldn't reach the ground. And so there's no way for me to actually like put a quadrat down over the top of this 8-foot Tule and count it. And actually, I like called a mentor, and he was like, "I think you just got to crawl through it." And so we actually, set up our quadrats by going around the perimeter of the Tule, and then literally like tunneling through it and putting our quadrats, around the stems, closing it up, and then counting what's in them. So it's a lot of crawling. We take flashlights in the middle of the day. We're over there. Like people have asked, like, "Why are you carrying flashlights?" And we're like, dark in there.
Wow.
But yeah, so we really get in there and hands and knees. We recently did one post-burn survey of these areas that were flooded by the lake. It rose a lot with the rains. And so we were in chest waders, and the water was like up to our chest, and we were trying to count Tule stems like that. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
It's really cool. It's really challenging, but a lot of fun.
Yeah, totally. That's really intense, but very cool, like you said. So I'm also curious, are there places like books you recommend or podcasts or other resources that folks can go to learn more about good fire and like what the history of taking away good fire was and how people are like bringing it back now.
Yeah, there are a couple of really good books. I would recommend a lot of the works of Kay Anderson. I think like Tending the Wild is like the major book, but she also has one specifically about oaks and fire. Let's see, there are some really good documentaries that have come out recently through, I think it's KSET, the California Public TV. They have some really good episodes on Indigenous burning. I'm trying to think. There's the Good Fire Alliance up in like Northern California that does a lot of good work, and Tara's website has some information. So yeah, I think some of the organizations that are doing the work would be good starts.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. And one last question before we close out. How can people support ongoing efforts to bring back prescribed burning and Indigenous cultural burning and Indigenous sovereignty, whether it's through data like you were talking about or other means? Can you tell us more?
Yeah, that's a big question. I feel like there's a lot of things to do there. In the Bay Area, I know there are some organizations like Seguro Land Trust, and in Santa Cruz where I was living, there's the Alma Mutsun Land Trust. So there's several land trusts that are acquiring land either through purchase or through gifts from people. So people returning land. I think that's actually a really big part of it. I think also just volunteering and supporting whenever there are calls out for people to go and remove invasive species or help with like plant restoration, all kinds of stuff. In terms of the burning, I feel like there is kind of some obstacles to getting involved because you kind of have to go through some training and stuff. But I think that everybody should like go to prescribed burns and see fire on the ground. I remember when I went to my first burn, I told everyone, like, I have no idea how this fire is going to behave. I've only seen it in a fireplace in my home or in a campsite. And I have no sense of like, how fast is this fire going to move? Am I going to have to run? And they're like, no, it's going to be really slow. Like, so I think, yeah, just going out and seeing and like participating in fire is really important. And I think I think people from like urban and rural areas need to experience fire in a good way. And a lot of the ecosystems that we have and that we live in need fire. So I think just even supporting it rhetorically, telling people the benefits of fire, all that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know I'm learning a lot tonight and like excited to go and check out the resources that you mentioned and more. But thank you so much for being here. Lovely to hear from you and hear about your story. Yeah.
Thanks.
We're going to go ahead and bring Darian back up to close us out for the night.
Thank you so much to Debbie, Sean, and Nicholas for sharing your work in seismology, There is a massive frog in my throat.
Yeah, you're not in Thule wetlands. They're in your home.
No, I guess it's all like those chorus frogs. Thank you so much for sharing all of your work in seismology, meteorology, and fire ecology on this 21st night of September. If I'm being honest, we kind of devised this program because we love the idea of the title. I didn't realize like how impactful and like how much of a newfound respect I have for all of these natural forces. I mean, every night school, I'm like actually in awe.
Yeah. We
live in a really cool world.
We really do, with some really phenomenal people who are studying it. So thank you all for being here. Seriously. And I hope that y'all watching go and listen to this song September at least once before the night ends in spirit of celebrating earth, wind, and fire in the ways that our guests have presented here and otherwise. But we here on Night School are live on the third Thursday of every month, which means that we will be back on October 19th, smack in the middle of spooky season. And we will hopefully be demystifying a little bit of death, just a little bit. It's a pretty big topic there. We'll be talking about animals and the animals that hold funerals. We'll be talking about how humans can embrace environmentally friendly practices post-mortem, and so much more on an episode that we're calling Night School After Life.
Until then, you should definitely subscribe to the California Academy of Sciences YouTube channel. If you do, you'll be notified every time that Night School is in session. There you can also rewatch all of our past episodes, including this one, like literally hours worth of learning from the world's coolest researchers, creators, and innovators for free, anytime, anywhere. It's the Night School way.
And if you'd like, here is a QR code and a link that's about to go into the chat to a survey that'll help us continue making Night School with all of you in mind, regulars, newcomers, anybody in between. We'd love if you took a second to fill it out. And for those of you who already have, thank you so much. Keep an eye out, and you may just be pleasantly surprised at some upcoming episode topics.
Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, our presenters and our viewers. We will see you next month. Take care.
Take care. Good night.
Bye.